Hello, welcome back to FM Live. My name is Mike Usrey, and today I'm going to be talking about engine mounts or motor mounts. So before we get into this, I want to invite anybody that has any questions. If you do have questions about engine mounts, motor mounts, whatever you'd like to call them, put them down in the comments below. We do have quite a bit to talk about today, but if we have any room towards the end of the video, I will try to talk about some of the questions that we got during the live video as well. So, to get into engine mounts or motor mounts, what are they? So for the uninitiated, engine mounts or motor mounts, as a lot of people will refer to them, they're kind of an interchangeable term depending on who you ask. I know that there are some people out there that are really particular and only consider motors to be electric, and we won't get into that particular topic today. But for the purpose of this video, I will consider them interchangeable. But in short, they are mounts or a way to mount an engine or a motor into a car. And they will look different from car to car. They will be positioned differently from car to car. But since we're focusing on Miatas, it's pretty much going to be that you have two mounts, one on either side of the bottom of the engine or towards the bottom of the engine, that will help the engine stay in place and keep it firmly mounted to part of the subframe, or K-member as some people will call it as well. So let's take a look at some of these engine mounts and what they actually look at. Here in front of me on the table, I do have some examples of engine mounts that we sell. And just for an easy point of reference, because they've been around forever, I'll showcase NAs and NBs. This is a stock engine mount. So engine mounts typically, but not always, are going to be constructed of some pieces of metal, usually plate-looking pieces, and then they'll have an attachment point on the bottom and on the top. So that way one side can be bolted to your subframe, and then the other side will actually bolt to your engine or a bracket on your engine, so that way that side of the engine can be mounted firmly. And then that's just one of them, but here, I'll take these ones. You'd usually have two of them, one mounted on either side, the left-hand, right-hand side of the engine, and that's what holds it to the subframe, or keeps it from escaping the subframe. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But in essence, they're basically bits of metal with usually some rubber or polyurethane, which attaches the engine in place. And it also has a secondary main function, which is to absorb some of the vibration of the engine. The engine itself, when you rev it up, when it's doing, well, basically making horsepower, crankshaft is turning, things are moving, pistons and connecting rods are going up and down, and all kinds of stuff is moving inside the engine, there's lots of vibrations that happen. And part of an engine mount's job is also to help control or at least damp some of that NVH, or noise vibration harshness, from the engine, so that way you don't feel every little vibration and shake and shimmy and thing that happens inside the engine while you're driving the car. And we'll get into some of the differences between the rubber versus poly in a little bit, but in essence, those are the two jobs that an engine mount has. Keep the engine in place and also help to control some of that noise and vibration that happens within the engine. Why would you need or want an engine mount? Should be fairly obvious. But why might you want to change an engine mount? So an engine mount, because it is typically, like we'll just say for the stock ones anyway, because it's made of rubber, that rubber over time, because it's dealing with vibrations and all of that movement as the engine is rocking around in the engine bay, the rubber does tend to wear out. Also, rubber just in general, it is something that will weather. So even if you don't have a whole bunch of miles on it, or if you don't have a whole bunch of aggressive driving, rubber itself will deteriorate and degrade over time, and it will need to be replaced. So this is something that is a wear item, believe it or not. And especially if you own an older NA or NB that has a lot of miles on it, if you can feel, actually, well, I won't break off into an anecdote, but if you've ever driven an older NA or NB especially that has a lot of miles on it and hasn't had a lot of love, you may actually accelerate and then let off the throttle suddenly, and you can feel and hear a big clunk in the engine bay in front of you. And that's because oftentimes with this style of mount, they'll actually rip over time and with lots of age and deterioration. So with time and with use, you will have to plan on replacing them because they do wear out. That's just the nature of the beast, as with a lot of other rubber components on cars. So we have options that you can replace with either factory units or some of these other options. And let's go ahead and talk about these other options, since we kind of discussed what an engine mount does, what it's supposed to be there for, and why you might need to replace it. In general, and there's not really a defined number, because you can look in your user's manual that comes with the car, and Mazda won't give you like a mileage or a time that you need to replace your mounts. Usually, in our experience, engine mounts are good for somewhere between probably 45,000 to 60,000 miles. Rough numbers here. You know, generally speaking, this rubber will wear out within some kind of a time frame. So if you haven't checked your engine mounts recently, we'll also talk about how to do that in a little bit, but they do have a lifespan. When it does come time to replace them, you might consider doing just a replacement with the same factory part. Especially if yours are ripped or torn, just putting in good new ones will make a big difference in keeping your engine where it's supposed to be, and will also help reduce some of that NVH that we talked about earlier. Besides rubber options, or at least the rubber stock options, you may also consider doing something that's an upgraded rubber stock option. So we carry two options beyond stock, and one of these is from, well, here, flip the box around so you can see the branding, from IL Motorsport. So IL Motorsport and Mazda Competition, which is another brand that we carry, have options that are basically very, very similar in pretty much every dimension to a stock rubber engine mount, but they are a stiffer rubber. So generally speaking, these are going to be about 40% stiffer rubber than the factory engine mounts. Now, why would I want stiffer rubber engine mounts? A good benefit to having stiffer rubber mounts is that they will actually tend to keep your engine more solidly in place, so that way the engine isn't flopping around all over, or at least as much as it would be even with new factory mounts. So what benefit does that give you? If you've ever been driving at the track, especially if it was one of your first times on track and you're really excited and you're just hammering through the gears, having a great time, you come into a corner a little bit hot, you get a little flustered, you go to downshift, and you just absolutely bork it. You miss a gear. Instead of getting into second, like you're intending to, you actually shift into fourth, or, you know, if you're upshifting and you go for third and you hit fifth instead, you know, basically you miss the gate that you were intending to go for because you were trying to get into gear quickly, and because your engine had been rocking around, you missed it, because with the engine rocking around, it's also moving your transmission, which your shifter is attached to, and that makes it a little bit of a moving target to get into whatever gear you're aiming for. So by stiffening up or replacing with a stiffer engine mount, you do help keep everything more in place relative to the chassis and the car that you're sitting in, so that way shifting into other gears is a little bit less of a moving target. At least it helps keep the target from moving around quite so much. So you might consider a stiffer engine mount like the IL Motorsport or the Mazda Competition rubber mounts if you're looking for a little bit of an improvement there, keeping the driveline in place without making significant amounts of NVH. So this is where the sliding scale comes in, because as you get to stiffer and stiffer engine mounts, such as these polyurethane engine mounts that we carry from Innovative Motorsports, they are made of a different material. They're not rubber, they are polyurethane. So polyurethane is similar to rubber in that it is a solid, but it does flex and it has some movement to it. But generally speaking, most polyurethanes are going to be stiffer than their rubber counterparts. Now, this is not the same mount. This is for an NB and this is for an NC, so forget the way that they look for now, but just the material-wise, a polyurethane mount is going to keep an engine even more securely located in the engine bay at the expense of transmitting a little bit more NVH than even the stiffer rubber compounds can. You can mitigate this a little bit by making a slightly different design, and in this case, Innovative has chosen to use a larger and proprietary polyurethane that does help mitigate some of the NVH that you do tend to pick up with a polyurethane mount. But that being said, it's still polyurethane. You're still going to notice more NVH out of this mount than you would an equivalent NA or NB rubber mount, especially the factory one. So this all comes down to a sliding scale moment of where on that scale does your car need to be, or would it work best for your car and your driving style? And this is the hard question, because you have to be honest with yourself, and I know that sucks, but is this car something that you drive on the street? Is it something you drive on the track? Do you a little bit of both? Because depending upon how you're driving it, and also your personal preference of, I like to drive my car really aggressively, I'm just in it to have fun, you know, this is not my daily driver, but I have fun in this car. Or, you know, I don't want to accidentally spill my drink in the cup holder because I don't want to get too crazy while I'm driving. That's fine too, but you have to take those kinds of things into consideration when you're talking about upgrading or changing out stock components for things that are stiffer for performance, but also stiffer for more NVH. For instance, if you want as comfortable as stock a ride-like feel, you probably just want a stock style engine mount. We can help you with that. If you're thinking that this is a daily driver, but I've missed my 2-3 shift a little bit too much and I keep going into 5th gear by accident, well, you might consider the Mazda Competition or IL Motorsport mounts, because they are stiffer, but they're not that much stiffer. Personally, I really like this as kind of a middle of the road option, because you only just notice the NVH a little bit. And especially if you have a good suspension under the car while you're moving, it's not that noticeable. A little bit, but not much. So improving your shifting quality with a little bit stiffer mount like this is a good in-between without going too crazy. You don't have to go crazy though. As mentioned, you could do the polyurethane mounts as long as they're smartly designed, and you will notice NVH, but this would be an option that I would use for something that's either a more on the fun end of the spectrum, that you drive aggressively, but you're not really daily driving this or worried about it being the most comfortable in the world, because getting a poly mount like this will keep your engine and driveline very securely in place without going crazy. Now, the one thing on this table that I haven't shown you, because we don't offer it, are solid engine mounts. They do exist. Unless you are racing for money, I strongly recommend doing something other than solid engine mounts. They're out there, but boy, if you've ever wondered what it's like to ride an electric toothbrush, that's what it feels like. So, poly mounts like this are a good in-between that's not quite on the crazy end, as long as they're well designed. One of my favorite things, I guess, that I'll cover specifically about the poly mounts that we have from Innovative is that they feature a unusually large diameter bushing along with the proprietary polyurethane blend that they use in these bushings. But because it's such a large bushing, it's actually able to absorb more NVH than a standard like a shackle mount that you see that's kind of the style, but usually just a smaller diameter bushing. So these do help keep everything very solidly in place, but they do a better job than a lot of the other mount options we've tried as far as actually absorbing NVH and not having quite so much a race car feel to the car after installing them. I still wouldn't recommend it if you're installing these on your grandma's car who only drives it to church on Sundays. She probably wouldn't appreciate that, but if you're a bit more on the sporty and track or autocross end of the spectrum, it's still a pretty good choice as long as you don't mind a little bit extra NVH. Okay, so we've gone through quite a bit of material I had decided to bring in here at first. One of the questions we got in advance was, how difficult are these to install? That's a loaded question, I have to tell you. It depends greatly on which car we're talking about. NAs and NBs, if you're doing stock style mounts like these guys, not too terrible. I will say in advance that all of the Miatas, I wouldn't say it's a fun job to do because it's at the bottom of the engine bay and space is generally a bit tight. Not terrible, but eh. But in general, for most of these mounts, what you'll need to do is loosen up the mounts in position that are already there. You'll need to usually, if you've got it on the ground behind you, or behind me, you'll usually want to use jack stands and or a floor jack, so that way when you have everything loose, you can actually use the floor jack to rock the engine up on one side, replace that mount, set it back down, and then do the other side. You can also do it if you have a lift using an engine support that goes across on the fender braces. Most people don't have that, so unless you're a shop or you've got stuff set up for a shop, that can be a good option too. But generally speaking, you're going to need basic tools, ratchets, wrenches, screwdrivers, that kind of stuff to get access to the underside of your car, take off the splash pan, that kind of stuff. And then all of the hardware that's on here is going to be nuts, bolts, that kind of stuff. And then you'll have to be able to move the engine a bit to be able to get old stuff out, new stuff in. If you've never done it before, I would say you should probably plan on at least a full afternoon to be able to do the job yourself. Be a good job to have somebody that's done this before. So if you can grab a local Miata Club member, or racer club guy that you can at least have there for a second set of eyes and some extra hands, it's a good plan. Oh, another question we got was, do the newer generations of Miata need these engine mounts? Sure. Again, it kind of boils down to what's the age and how they've been driven. If you have an older car, NAs and NBs, you're almost assuredly going to need engine mounts if they haven't been replaced here in the not too distant past. These rubber guys, again, maybe 45 to 60,000 miles as far as like actually being intact and sound, usable parts. It's not uncommon for NAs and NBs for this to just be totally split. NCs and NDs, generally speaking, they're newer, they have fewer miles on them, so it's not as common that they'll need to be replaced, or at least not yet. Of course, as things get older, that'll be something that you'll need to keep an eye on. Now, how do you check to see if you need engine mounts? Good question. So actually, Travis, if you would follow me around over here, we'll just take a quick peek at the car. This is something that if you have either a buddy that's pretty strong, and I say that because I'm not that strong, or if you're not that strong like me, you can just use a breaker bar of sorts. And what I like to do is find a point between your block, usually like here on this engine hoist mount, and then one of the engine mount brackets that's either on this side. On the NDs, it's a little bit tough. I'd probably actually choose somewhere on the exhaust side. But basically, get your breaker bar, wedge it down between your block and a bracket for like your AC or your power steering or something like that, a big, heavy, chunky bracket. But you can take that breaker bar and then you can move the whole engine or rock the engine back and forth from left to right. And if you hear any big clunks, if you feel any big clunks, that means your engine mount is torn. Or just in general, if you have a lot of really easy wiggle on it, it's probably time to replace your engine mount. In extreme cases, if both of your mounts are torn and you have somebody in the driver's seat and they rev up your engine while it's just sitting still, and then they let off the throttle suddenly, you'll see the whole engine rock and jump around. That's when it's really, really bad. So you likely won't see that unless this is quite an old car and it has been neglected most of its life. But if you do the test with a breaker bar, usually you'll be able to tell if your engine mounts are intact or not. Of course, the best option is get under the car, take a look. Do you see any cracks in the rubber? Because when rubber degrades, when it gets worn out, you will see that it'll have usually lots of horizontal cracks across it. And that's a good indicator that it's time to replace your engine mounts. So a good visual inspection can't be beat most of the time. All right. Let's cover another one that's a bit more track-oriented. Will these improve my lap times? Maybe. It's very possible, especially if you've got really beat-up old engine mounts, that if you're missing lots of shifts, or if you find that it's really hard for you to get into gear simply because your shift turret is moving around so much, yeah, you probably are wasting a few milliseconds here and there. Especially if you drag race the car, if you're one of those guys that drag races their Miata, you'll probably notice that there's a substantial amount of time to be saved by getting some upgraded engine mounts. I have taken my Miata to the track, the drag strip a couple of times, and I'm very bad at it, so I won't say I'm an expert, but having done it a few times, luckily I did have some upgraded engine mounts in it, so it wasn't a big deal, but missing shifts at the drag strip will cost you quite a bit of time. So yeah, answer is maybe. How's your shifting? That's up for you to decide. So I think, let's check for any comments, any questions that we have so far. What do we have?
The first question, with aftermarket poly motor mounts, do you sell just the bushing inserts if I want to change the hardness of the insert, for instance?
Good question. Okay, so question is, with these style polyurethane engine mounts, do we sell just the inserts, just the bushings by themselves in case you wanted to change the durometer? That's the fancy word for how much stiffness your bushings are. And the short answer is no. We don't sell the inserts by themselves. However, if you decide that this particular insert isn't what you want, or maybe you had an accident and you accidentally ruined one of these bushings or something like that, you can get replacements, but you have to go to Innovative directly. We don't sell just the inserts by themselves. I will take this opportunity to say that these particular bushings that we carry, that are with these Innovative mounts we sell, they are the softest ones that Innovative offers. So we find that they're a good mix of performance and comfort without going too crazy either way. If you have a 400, 500 horsepower Miata and you're drag racing it, you probably want something stiffer for that kind of power because your engine's going to be moving around quite a bit. But if you find that you do want something more, or if you just need to replace them, Innovative can get you taken care of for replacement bushings. What else do we have?
What is the estimated service life for stock motor mounts versus poly mounts?
Oh, good one. So comparing the lifespan of a rubber engine mount versus poly. So generally speaking, polyurethane is a much longer lived material than most vulcanized rubber. So just like tires, belts, engine mounts, that kind of stuff, vulcanized rubber, it will have a shorter lifespan, generally speaking, just because of weather and other elements that act upon it, dry it out, deteriorate it. Polyurethane is a little bit better about most of that. It is a synthetic material that is, it's poured like an epoxy in most cases, and it will set up, and it's usually much less porous in almost every case compared to rubbers, and it won't absorb moisture as much. It's not as affected, generally speaking, by vibration. It's a little bit more, I'm not sure there's a great term. Probably there is, I'm just not knowledgeable enough about it. Bounciness, that it is able to handle vibration at a better degree than rubber is in most cases. So generally speaking, in almost everything that an engine mount has to do for longevity purposes, usually polyurethane will outlive the equivalent rubber piece, unless we're talking about apples to oranges for different horsepower ratings or different applications. So if you're looking for longest lived, yeah, polyurethane will probably beat rubber in pretty much every case. Good question. I don't think I've been asked that before, actually. What else do we have?
This commenter has a long tube aftermarket header that produces lots of heat. For heat protection of the engine mount, would we recommend wrapping the exhaust or covering the mount with heat management products?
Good. There's another good one. Excellent. I like your questions today. So the question was about, you have an aftermarket header system, probably thin wall, stainless, T304 or whatever the case is, puts off lots of heat. Do you need to be concerned about poly versus rubber? Should you wrap your headers? What should you do? So that is a great question, because that's the one thing I actually didn't talk about in my previous question about longevity. Sometimes rubber is better than poly when it comes to heat. Not always, but generally speaking, polyurethane does tend to melt if you get it too hot, whereas vulcanized rubber, it's vulcanized. That's part of the process, is them getting it hot, kind of curing it. So you can burn rubber, but you can't necessarily, or at least it's unlikely to melt it, this kind of rubber. So if you are right up against a really hot exhaust system, we're talking within an inch or so of an exhaust system, and it's getting that much radiant heat, or hopefully you're not actually getting direct contact heat on these mounts. Poly can melt. So if you are running a custom exhaust system and you have poly mounts or poly anything for that matter really close to your exhaust, you should probably be pretty careful and do what you can to mitigate that heat transfer. Use heat shielding, use DEI wrap, you know, whatever you need to do. A good old heat shield will oftentimes at least prolong, if not save your components a lot of wear and tear, especially if it's poly, because if it's liquid, it doesn't do much good. Good question. I'll just say that that's one of those that if you have a specific application and you're unsure, maybe send us some pictures via email and we can go from there, see if we can get you helped out. What else we have?
Final question. If you use the lower height with the poly mounts, do you need to correct for PPF alignment or anything else?
Oh, man, you guys are on it today. So the question is about these style mounts. The eagle-eyed among you have probably noticed that they actually have multiple mounting positions on this style mount. And because this is so much different than a factory style mount, you can actually move this around to lower the engine compared to a stock engine mount. So the question is, if you do that, do you need to realign your PPF or drive shaft angles or whatever else? Do you need to worry about driveline angles further on down towards the back of the chassis? It is a small amount of difference that we're talking about. The Miata already has, and these ones in particular, NANBs, just to be specific, they are already dealing with minute amounts of driveline angle to begin with, and the PPF holds the transmission and the differential pretty much at a set angle because they're literally bolted together. In most cases, I doubt anybody would have any issues that they would need to, but if you do feel any additional vibration, especially if it gets worse with speed, yeah, that would be something that you can realign by loosening up the bolts on either end of your PPF. And there is actually a procedure. Check out our clutch installation instructions for how to reset your PPF angle or driveline angle and get it tightened up to the correct specification. It's pretty straightforward. Basically, you need a tape measure and a 2x4 or something to stretch across the frame rails of the car underneath. So if you feel anything, you can do that. It's pretty uncommon that you'll need to because we're only changing that angle by itty bitty increments. But good question. That's excellent. That is another feature. If you're racing and you're looking for every little extra bit you can lower your center of gravity slightly by using these mounts to lower your engine, transmission, and the rest of your driveline just a little bit. It does put your oil pan that much closer to the bottom of the car. So if you're slammed and dragging and making sparks and all that kind of stuff, maybe that's not a good plan for you. If you like oil in your engine, probably not great to set that down low for the drift guys. What else? Is that it? Man, we got some good questions today. Cool. Well, I thank you very, very much for watching and for all of the questions and interacting with us today. This was a pretty great video. If you like this kind of video, give us a thumbs up. Hopefully you learned something. Feel free to share this with anybody else that's asking about engine mounts, and they can hopefully learn something too. And if there are any other questions that I didn't answer in this video, feel free to drop us a comment below, and we will try to get back to you then. Of course, you can also reach out to us directly via email, phone, Facebook. We actually have a new chat function that is live on our website now, so you've got all kinds of options to reach out to us. Feel free to drop us a line. We'd be happy to help you out. And like always, we will see you next time. Thanks again.